Live from Washington, D.C., this is Balance of Power with Joe Mathieu and Kailey Leinz.
It's D+3. Welcome to the Tuesday edition. As the White House warns, the war with Iran could last much longer than many first thought, with the president saying we have the munitions to fight forever. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kailey Leinz in Washington on this day 4 of the war. Kailey, the markets woke up very worried about all of this, but we've actually seen some real improvement in the midday trade.
Well, at least when it comes to equities, you are still seeing a massive amount of upward pressure on commodities prices, oil, natural gas, especially in Europe, surging today as we contend with the notion that there could be something of an energy supply shock if we continue to see the Strait of Hormuz effectively close and more damage to energy infrastructure in the Middle East. President Trump, though, when pressed on that in the Oval Office, where he actually took questions from the press as he met with the German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, said, yes, prices may be higher for a while, but he thinks when this is all over, they will go back down to lower than before. The question we all have is, when will this all be over? Well,
that's true. And he used the word forever in that Truth Social post, which really spooked the markets earlier. And you're right. Oil prices have been stubbornly higher. We saw big increases as well in a lot of energy stocks. Those have all faded away ever since then. The one thing that's up right now is the VIX, Kailey, at 24. But to have seen the Dow Industrial Average down over 1,200 points, it is at least somewhat reassuring to see that loss cut in half. That all seemed to coincide with the president's remarks in the Oval Office. We carried him live here on Bloomberg TV and radio. He didn't answer a lot of questions specifically, but I feel like his confidence, his optimism may have rubbed off on the markets in a good way. We'll have to see where we end the session. Yeah,
his suggestion that Iran's naval capability, its missile capabilities, its radar capabilities, he says, in his words, everything basically has been wiped out.
That's right.
Though he did note that there is a worst case scenario here in which someone else comes into the leadership vacuum that is even worse or as bad as the previous supreme leader.
Pretty candid remarks there. He took a lot of questions, and we'll walk everyone through it over the course of this hour. We're going to check with Alexandra Semenova on the markets. Tyler Kendall will join us from the White House, and Kelly Grieco, who's an expert in asymmetric warfare, is going to be with us a little bit later on this hour. I'll be very curious to hear what she says about this idea of hundreds of thousands of drones facing off with our $1 million missiles. A barrel of crude selling for $75, a little over, up $4, up a little more than 5%. West Texas Intermediate with great concerns about what type of supply interruption we could be talking about in the days ahead. If that happens, it's obviously a great moment of uncertainty, but the S&P 500 has been clinging to that 6,800 level pretty stubbornly, and we explore this all a bit more with Alexandra Semenova, Bloomberg News equities reporter, with us also live from world headquarters in New York. Alexandra, what has your attention here in a day that has seen stocks recover somewhat, but still huge concerns about what's happening in the energy space?
Hey, Joe. Well, it is a firmly risk-off day today, with stocks and bonds deepening their losses since attacks began on Iran over the weekend. Definitely a stronger reaction today than we saw yesterday. About 450 shares in the S&P 500 were lower, and of course the Dow dropped as much as 1,200 points at some point in the trading day today. It is worth it pointing out that the S&P did pair a significantly deeper decline, at some point falling as much as 2.5% to an October low. Much of this has to do with soaring energy prices, casting a doubt on the ability of the Fed to cut interest rates given the risk it poses to inflation. We had Fed President Neil Kashkari today at Bloomberg Invest saying that the attacks on Iran put into doubt his call for an interest rate reduction later this year. Now, investors are contending with some cross currents here. On one hand, if you look at past geopolitical volatility, it's typically proven to be a good buying opportunity for stocks, given as long as oil prices have been contained. Now, in the aftermath of past escalations in the Middle East, the S&P 500 was higher by 2%, 6%, and 8% on average in the 1, 6, and 12-month periods that followed. This is according to data from Morgan Stanley. But the big caveat is when energy costs substantially surge, the level that crude oil prices would have to reach for it to become a pain point for equities is $100 per barrel. That is the threshold that typically becomes associated with negative equity returns, given it starts to weigh on consumer sentiment, on corporate earnings. We're not there yet, but investors today are signaling that they are worried that this could be more prolonged than expected yesterday.
Well, and what should we make, Alex, of the idea that we're not seeing a traditional flight to the havens that you would at least expect? Where can safety be sought right now?
That's the big question, Kailey, and I've been asking traders that all day long, and I really haven't gotten a solid answer from them because it seems to be a lot of folks trying to figure that out. Now, typically, tech used to be the safe haven trade given its strong balance sheets, but now we have all these concerns around artificial intelligence and CapEx spending, so that's not the traditional defensive play anymore. The common denominator that I've gotten from conversations I've had is people are looking at companies with strong balance sheets. There's been this flight to the halo trade, so looking at tangible assets, metals, kind of the companies that are building out AI technology versus the coders, and then also looking for companies that aren't necessarily tied to economic growth, given the risk that we could get a spike in inflation if this conflict persists.
All right, Bloomberg's Alexandra Semenova, thank you so much for joining us from New York. And we want to go to the White House next, where, again, as we mentioned just a moment ago, earlier this afternoon, President Trump was joined in the Oval Office by the German Chancellor Friedrich Merz with the war in Ukraine and trade issues on the agenda. But first and foremost, the ongoing conflict in Iran that the U.S. and Israel, of course, is continuing to prosecute this bombing campaign against Iranian targets, which the president contends largely have been wiped out in terms of Iran's military capabilities. But he was also pressed on this notion that we heard from the Secretary of State Marco Rubio and the House Speaker Mike Johnson yesterday, the idea that Israel was set to strike first and the U.S. joined in out of concern that Iran was going to retaliate against U.S. assets in the region. The president suggested that wasn't the case.
We were having negotiations with these lunatics, and it was my opinion that they were going to attack first. They were going to attack. If we didn't do it, they were going to attack first. I felt strongly about that. And we have great negotiators, great people that do this very successfully and have done it all their lives very successful. And based on the way the negotiation was going, I think they were going to attack first. And I didn't want that to happen. So if anything, I might have forced Israel's hand.
For more, we turn to Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall, who is live on the North Lawn of the White House for us. So, Tyler, not necessarily a consistent narrative we're getting from the president and others in his administration and close to him.
No, though, Kailey, we have heard consistently from senior administration officials starting this weekend when the attack started that they are calling this a preemptive defensive attack, which it appears President Trump was alluding to there, despite his Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, as you mentioned yesterday, telling reporters on Capitol Hill that they were confident that Israel was going to launch a strike that would very likely mean retaliation against U.S. targets. So an interesting back and forth there, I guess you could say, as we've been working through some of those other statements from the administration, including the objectives of this mission, as well as what the ultimate goal is going to be, right? We heard from the Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth yesterday saying that the original intent was not going to be what he called, quote, so-called regime change, though they are hoping that the Iranian people take advantage of this moment. In their words, President Trump went on in that Oval Office meeting to talk about how what the worst thing would be was if the regime stayed in place in the same sort of era that it has been fostering. And President Trump wants to see leadership change when it comes to Iran. The question then becomes, what does that actually look like? The president had said before that there were a few options that they were eyeing that the U.S. felt that it could work with, but that all of those people have been killed in the strikes. That's something that we're going to be watching really closely as this ultimately develops, because from an operational level, the U.S. and Israel are continuing their bombardment of Iran. Joe and Kailey, we got confirmation this morning from the IDF that this is now the 9th wave of strikes against the country.
Straight from the Oval Office, Tyler Kendall, Bloomberg Washington correspondent, live at the White House. Tyler, we thank you, and thanks for being there for that incredible conversation with the president. Here's a little bit more of a taste of what the president said about what's been accomplished in just the last 4 days. Listen.
They have no Navy. It's been knocked out. They have no Air Force. It's been knocked out. They have no air detection. That's been knocked out. Their radar has been knocked out. And just about everything's been knocked out. So we'll see how we do. But we're doing very well. We have a great military, and they're doing a fantastic job.
And even if that remains the case, there are great questions about our supply of munitions, with the president on Truth Social earlier today said could in fact last forever, the word that he used. We could fight forever. But there's a fascinating story on the terminal that questions Iran's missile math. As Bloomberg News puts it, $20,000 drones taking on $4 million Patriots. Something we wanted to talk to Kailey Grieco about, who specializes in asymmetric warfare, senior fellow with the Reimagining U.S. Grand Strategy program at the Stimson Center. Kailey, thank you for joining us as we face the prospect of hundreds of thousands more drones potentially being sent to us, to our allies, in attack by Iran. There are questions about whether, in fact, this is the right approach, or we should be using a different technology to fight them. What do you think?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I think you hit the nail on the head in that there is a real issue here in terms of the sustainability of cost, particularly if you're going to use exquisite systems to intercept these relatively low-cost Shahed drones. I think the United States is probably trying to not use things like its Patriot interceptors for this and holding those in reserve only when it's absolutely necessary. It's probably trying to rely on some other methods, but they're still fairly costly. Like we've seen F-16s, for example, or F-15s flying in the air and using anti-air missiles against these. We're now seeing Apaches that are also being used in this role. Traditionally, they hunt tanks, but now they're hunting Shahed drones. But we don't really have a lot of low-cost sustainable options at the moment.
Well, so when we consider that, then, Kailey, when expensive as these things may be, when we consider the quantity we have of them and where they are, do we have adequate capacity in the Middle East right now, or are we going to have to be pulling these assets from other theaters?
Oh, well, I think when we combine both the missile threat, because there's still the ballistic missile threat and the drone threat, there's sort of a race going on right now between the ability of the United States and Israel, and now it seems Qatar, to be able to find, locate, and destroy the infrastructure for its Iranian missiles and the launchers, the drone facilities, to try to destroy that. So they can't get as much in the air and take off the pressure on the interceptors. But if you look at the basic math, particularly against the war, before the war, it certainly favored Iran and just sheer numbers. The question becomes, how effective is it being at degrading those capabilities? But the reality is, even what we've done so far, we've actually gone in significantly into our own stockpiles of these interceptors. And the important thing to really understand is that you can use these interceptors and buy down short-term risk today by using more of the inventory, but you can't remake these overnight. You can't replace them overnight. You're not probably going to even be able to replace them this year. We're talking about years to be able to replace these interceptors.
Well, then I'd love for you to help us interpret the president's post on Truth Social. Decode this for us, Kailey Grieco. He writes, the U.S. munition stockpiles have, at the medium and upper medium grade, you could qualify that for us, never been higher or better. He writes, as was stated to me today, we have a virtually unlimited supply of these weapons. Wars can be fought forever and very successfully using just these supplies. Is that true?
Well, I am not sure what he means exactly by medium grade. I have two different thoughts in response. One is that it is true that when you're talking about shorter range things on offense, particularly if we're able to not rely as much on long range munitions and we're able to get closer to targets on Iran, you can rely on shorter range things. We have that in larger numbers. So on the offensive strikes, we can sustain this for quite a while. The air defense, missile defense issue becomes much more challenging. There are just certain realities around those stockpiles that we can't really escape.
Kailey, obviously, when we're watching the markets today, we are seeing major upward pressure on commodities, oil and natural gas prices surging as we consider whether or not the Strait of Hormuz is going to be safely navigable for tankers in order to get that product and crude out of the region. Is it possible for the U.S. or Israeli forces to do what proved very difficult to do with the Houthis in the Red Sea and make sure that the strait is secure for transit with the resources we have, and knowing we also actively are trying to play defense with the drones and everything else that Iran is sending out right now?
Yeah, I mean, this is a very tall order for the reasons that you highlighted. That we've, did this earlier with the Houthis, and the Houthis have, also been threatening that they're going to resume their strikes as well. The question is that it's not even one threat at this point. Then, one of the challenges here is you're going to have to start making some acute decisions, because if you want to protect commerce in the Strait of Hormuz, then those same, missile defense ships are not going to be able to provide some level of coverage for, the carrier strike group itself, or to help protect some of the ports of Gulf states. And so it's these kinds of trade-offs that are just that are cute, and we can't escape them. That's just the reality.
We understand that Iran was estimated to have about 2,000 ballistic missiles after last year's conflict with Israel. Based on what's taken place over the last 4 days, drones aside, Kelly, what do we think that might leave behind?
Yeah, I mean, it's a little hard to estimate because there's a lot we don't know. But I did see that a couple of days ago, the Israelis announced that they thought they had destroyed about half the launchers. They were believed to have about 200 launchers before the war, and so they may be down to about 100. That's still significant. I haven't heard as much about the stockpiles of the missiles themselves. My sense would be that we'll know over time. I think particularly the next couple of days, as we start to see to what degree they're able to sustain these salvos. If we start seeing a drop off, then we can have a higher degree of confidence that we've actually managed to destroy some of this capability. But it is challenging. We're talking about trying to find things that are on trucks that can blend in. These are widely dispersed, and the Iranians were smart enough to realize that they shouldn't rely on a centralized command and control in Tehran for leading its forces. And so local commanders have been authorized to conduct these strikes. It makes it harder. It makes it much more resilient as a target.
All right, Kelly Grieco, we so appreciate your insight and expertise. She's senior fellow with the Reimagining U.S. Grand Strategy Program at the Stimson Center, here with us on Balance of Power. And we have more coming up. We'll take you live to Capitol Hill, where Democratic Congressman Bill Foster of Illinois will be joining us. He's a PhD physicist. We'll talk more about Iran's nuclear program next on Bloomberg TV and radio. You here in Washington, tracking the developments we are seeing in the Middle East as the U.S. and Israel continue now for a fourth day strikes against targets in Iran. We know thousands at this point have been hit. The president outlining the targeting of the Iranian Navy, Air Force, radar systems. He said all of these things have effectively been wiped out. And this is after, remember, back in June of last year, the president said the U.S. had successfully obliterated Iran's nuclear program, though there's been reporting of nuclear targets being involved in this as well. And we wanted to drill in on the nuclear aspect here as we turn to the only PhD physicist in Congress. Democratic Congressman Bill Foster of Illinois is joining us live now from Capitol Hill. Congressman, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. It's good to have you. When we consider what we do know and what we don't know about what Iran's remaining capabilities and stockpiles were after the June strike, how confident are you that we can successfully and finally obliterate it now?
Well, the key question that we have not yet heard an answer to from the Trump administration is what has become of Iran's extensive inventory of 60% enriched uranium. There is a misunderstanding a lot of people have that unless it is quote-unquote weapons grade, 90% enriched uranium, that it is not usable to make a weapon. But people should understand that the Hiroshima atomic bomb was a mixture of 50% and higher enriched uranium. The 60% enriched stockpile that Iran was seen to have been producing by the IAEA was, a lot can be done on that. And the administration has been forthcoming with us in terms of getting technical briefings. I have bipartisan requests that got answered very well by NNSA about what exactly technically could Iran do with the stockpile of 60% enriched uranium. And it was pretty much what had been predicted by a large number of pundits, where they say, look, you can make a large number a significant number, a handful of Hiroshima-style devices with their 60% enriched uranium. It's a straightforward thing. The fact that we've obliterated their factories to make large inventories of weapons-grade material doesn't mean much unless we have destroyed or seized or brought under inspection the inventory of 60% enriched material. And at least we have not in Congress got any accounting for where that is and what we know about it.
So has Congress also seen evidence that there was, in fact, an imminent threat posed by Iran, a nuclear threat to the United States?
I have not seen it. And I've talked to members of the Gang of Eight who said, among other things, that they had no indication that this was intended to be a decapitating strike, a clear act of war. And the problem for a large number of members of Congress, including essentially all Democrats, is that the Constitution provides a way that this should have happened. If the nuclear negotiations were actually stuck, then Trump should have gone to Congress, explained the situation, asked for an authorization for the use of military force, and then waited for a target of opportunity. That did not happen, and that was a breach of our Constitution.
Well, I'm not sure, Congressman, if you still see a path forward for negotiations over the nuclear program, if there is a remaining diplomatic path here. But if there were one, knowing how the president has railed against the JCPOA agreement that was reached during the Obama administration, do you see areas in which what was that agreement should be tightened, should be changed, if there is to be another one?
Well, the thing that you have to do is to put in any agreement at this point that will be, worth signing. There has to be a very intrusive inspection throughout all of Iran by the IAEA and other trusted authorities, snap inspections to make sure they haven't restarted it. But there is an opportunity to have a well-prescribed regional reprocessing and enrichment capability that Iran could participate in. One of the interesting proposals for that is to put it on one of the islands in the middle of the Gulf that Iran owns some of them. And if you had a very well-defined enrichment facility and nuclear, essentially a pipeline for manufacturing nuclear material, but it was on an island where everyone could see what they're doing and anyone unhappy with it could flatten the place, then you could have a satisfactory agreement where Iran would be able to tell its citizens that our nuclear program continues and that anyone from Saudi Arabia to Israel to the United States could destroy it at a moment's notice if they found the material was being diverted. And then you could have very severe inspection. So this has been proposed by Ernie Moniz, who is responsible for the negotiation of the Iran nuclear deal. And I think there is room for an agreement there that could meet everyone's requirements. But my biggest question at this point is they have essentially obliterated the top level of leadership. One of the only positive things about the Ayatollah is he apparently had a very strong fatwa against production of nuclear weapons. I have no idea who his successors are, what his successors' attitude toward production of nuclear weapons. Because if we have not locked down or destroyed their inventory of 60% enriched uranium, they could very rapidly make a handful of devices, not small compact devices you could put on a missile, but things that could be put into container freights and delivered through other means. And there's a very credible threat there that we have simply not been willing to talk about or certainly respond to.
So it sounds like in our remaining moment here, Congressman, that's your priority right now. The United States must identify that missing highly enriched uranium that is still somewhere in Iran. Do you not believe we know where that is?
I cannot talk about it, but I will say that I personally have not been given the information to give me confidence that we know what we're doing in this area.
Really glad you could join us. Congressman Bill Foster, Democrat, Illinois' 11th District. As Kailey mentioned, the only PhD physicist in Congress. So we wanted to get to that nuclear issue specifically before we assembled our political panel, and they're with us right now. Bloomberg Politics contributors Jeanne, Zaino, and Rick Davis. She is our Democratic analyst and democracy visiting fellow at Harvard Kennedy School's Ash Center. Rick is our Republican strategist and partner at Stonecourt Capital, and we've talked, Rick, about that missing stash of highly enriched uranium. Can we presume that the CIA has a good sense of where that is? And how important is it to find it?
Yeah, I would think the combined intelligence capabilities of Israel and the U.S. would have a pretty good sense and have been tracking for a long time the storage and location of that uranium. I think, one of the things that you have to consider when you hear the president's talking about using potentially ground troops is the ability to go and safeguard that uranium. Obviously, the only thing worse than having it in the hands of a bunch of terrorists like the Iranians is having it in the hands of other terrorists who you don't know. And so, I would think that there's got to be some kind of a war plan in effect right now, not only identifying it, but also with a couple of options on how to spirit it out of the country, because I can't imagine a scenario with this scale of activity where the U.S. would allow that uranium to stay in place.
Well, so Jeanne, I'd love for you to weigh in here on this notion that we're hearing mixed messaging from the administration around what exactly the goal was or what the remaining nuclear capabilities were of Iran, if it was really about the nuclear program or about the ballistic missile program or about the Iranian Navy or about regime change, when President Trump told reporters today the worst case scenario is that someone comes in who is just as bad as the supreme leader. Is there enough clarity, not just coming from President Trump, but the varying members of the administration who have also been put out there to address the press right now? Or do you find yourself just more confused?
More confused, and the answer to your question is absolutely no. This is about as clear as mud, and that is what makes it so incredibly dangerous. And I think your conversation with Representative Foster just encapsulates the danger here. They have stockpiles potentially 60% enriched, which can be incredibly dangerous and damaging to the world. We have no evidence, as far as we have been told yet, of an imminent threat that required us to go in. And yet we took out and decapitated their leadership. And by every stretch of imagination, we have no plan in which to change this regime. And even if and when we take out this regime, who gets replaced? Who goes in there? They are likely to be just as hardline or more hardline than the previous regime. And so that is the problem. Then what are they doing, Kailey? They are sitting there on top of 60% potentially enriched uranium and whatever else. Moreover, they will completely reconstitute whatever we take out. And that's why this is a really ham-fisted approach to doing this. And I think the reason we're not hearing clear objectives is what the Secretary of State said yesterday in Congress, which was stunning, or to the Gang of Eight, which was that we went in because we were concerned that Israel was going to strike. Well, that's like, me concerned that, Joe is going to strike you, Kailey, and then you're going to strike me, so I shoot him first. It makes no sense, particularly.
Wait a minute.
We don't get violent here on Balance of Power.
And you don't get violent, so I'm sorry to use you two kind folks as an example, but it makes no sense.
Yeah, I'm under fire here, Rick. I am curious to know what your thought is, though, on this line that we heard again from the Secretary of State yesterday and how the president responded to it today. He was asked, did Israel force your hand? And he said, based on the way negotiation was going, I think they were going to attack first. And I didn't want that to happen. So if anything, I might have forced Israel's hand. We've got a minute left. Rick, how do you read that answer?
I just am amazed by the lack of message discipline coming out of the administration, and it may be all of the above, right? I mean, there's a lot of reasons to do an operation like this, but you have to have a very clear and consistent message to the American people as to why are we in the process of bombing this country and taking out their leadership, as you pointed out. And look, I think it probably is some combination. But remember, those ships were brought from different theaters to surround Iran for months. This has been an effort in the progress. There's been a plan. Yeah. Now that plan's being carried out.
All right, Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino, Bloomberg Politics contributors, our political panel today. Thank you so much. I would note a red headline across the terminal. Spain says Trump must respect international law over trade after he threatened to cut all trade ties with that country. We'll have more still ahead here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. where, of course, the conversation is dominated by the ongoing war the U.S. and Israel are conducting against Iran. But on any other in any other circumstance, we might have led the show today with the fact that primaries are opening across the country as we get closer to the midterm elections in November. The primaries being held today in North Carolina, Arkansas, and perhaps most interestingly, in Texas, where the Senate race on both the Democratic and Republican side in particular is incredibly hot. On the Democratic side, you have Texas State Rep James Tallarico up against current Democratic Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, and it's a three-way race on the Republican side. The incumbent John Cornyn up against Texas State Attorney General Ken Paxton and Congressman Wesley Hunt. None of the three, mind you, have an endorsement from President Trump, who was in Texas just this last Friday in Corpus Christi, calling some of these guys out by name, but not necessarily saying he'll support them.
We have a great Attorney General, Ken Paxton. Where's Ken? Hi, Ken. Hi, Ken. And we have a great Senator, John Cornyn. Hi, John. Thank you, John. They're in a little race together. You know that, right? A little bit of a race. It's going to be an interesting one, right? They're both great people, too.
So for more, we turn to Julie Fine, who's Bloomberg's Texas bureau chief. Julie, the president says this is a little bit of a race. I would wager it might actually be more than a little bit. Is there any way, without a Trump endorsement for either of these candidates, that this doesn't end up going to a runoff?
I mean, that would be very surprising. The polls, of course, have been all over the place, but that's more on the Democratic side. Most of the polls on the Republican side have shown this race about 5 points apart. We received a press release from John Cornyn's campaign last week, and it gave the date of the primary. It also gave the date of a runoff. So obviously this is what the campaigns expect, even if they're not openly saying it, but it is very likely that you will see a runoff on the Republican side.
Julie, first of all, I've got to say happy primary day. This is supposed to be like Christmas morning for politicos. So happy primary day. They're celebrating in North Carolina as well. I'll also remind everybody that John Cornyn was considered as a front runner to be the Senate Majority Leader just a couple of years ago. This is the incumbent who somehow doesn't have the endorsement of the Commander-in-Chief. How come?
I mean, this is an incumbent who right now doesn't have the endorsement of the governor of this state. I think right now with the state of politics that it's difficult in this race. Ken Paxton has really said that John Cornyn is not conservative enough for Texas. John Cornyn, who at one point said he didn't even think that if Trump was the nominee could be the president, is now being, he's in a battle where they're saying that he's not conservative enough, even though if you look at John Cornyn's record, it is extremely conservative. So now he is touting his relationship with President Trump, but I think that's been somewhat of the problem here. I would imagine that many of the Republicans in the NRSC and around would like to see somebody get the endorsement in this race. They'd like to see it be John Cornyn because they think that could end it much quicker. But where we are right now, it looks like that this one will be headed to a runoff.
All right, Julie, good luck down there and keep us posted on things. She'll be watching closely tonight, and we'll be comparing notes on results tomorrow. Our Texas bureau chief, Julie Fine, real pleasure to add the voice of Jessica Taylor, the senator and governor's editor at the great Cook Political Report. It dawned on us this morning, Jessica, we've never had a chance to do this in person. So welcome to our bureau. It's great to see you, and happy primary day. I'll share with you as well. We've been talking about some very challenging geopolitical news until this moment that's kind of clouded this whole story, which to Kailey's point would have been our screaming lead on any other day here. So what's got your view this evening, or are you resigned to a runoff on the Republican side?
I do think it's going to be a runoff on the Republican side, but what's really surprising to me, you mentioned not just the Cornyn, how far he's fallen from coming just very short of being the Senate Majority Leader just a little over a year ago, is that this really comes down to style more than politics. When you look at sort of the ideology, John Cornyn still votes with Trump. Almost his ads are emphasizing that he votes with him. Right, exactly. But this is about it's about who sounds more MAGA, really, and that's Ken Paxton. Ken Paxton has been with Trump. He sued to try to overturn the results, but also that D.C. Republicans feel like And I agree that John Cornyn would be the most electable in a general election, and that they would have to spend a lot of money to kind of carry Ken Paxton over the finish line. But they've already spent over $67 million to try to boost John Cornyn, and his numbers in polling are somewhere in the 30%. Now, they've driven down Ken Paxton's numbers, and that's why I think we'll see a runoff, and because Wesley Hunt is in there too. But in a runoff, is it really going to make much of a difference? I think that's the real question. Ken Paxton would be favored in a runoff because we see in Texas those bring out the more conservative, more sort of stalwart conservatives.
Well, and to your point, the reason why groups, including the NRSC, is throwing all this money against Paxton to try to support Cornyn is because they are worried about general election politics, right? And the idea that Paxton would have a much tougher time actually retaining Republican control of this seat. That said, Democrats have been dreaming about flipping a Texas Senate seat blue for some time now. Is this moment actually different if Ken Paxton ultimately wins the runoff?
I think it depends on what happens on the Democratic side as well.
Okay, so Tallarico or Crockett?
Tallarico
Which one has
or
the better
Crockett?
chance against it?
I think it's Tallarico, and that's what national Republicans think too. They sort of trolled Jasmine Crockett almost into this race, putting out polls showing that she would win a primary. But Tallarico has the better ground game on Election Day. He's had more money. He's also spent more money on sort of traditional methods. But we're seeing historic numbers of Democratic primary turnout that might actually even exceed Republican turnout when all of the numbers are in, which would just be record breaking. And so that tells me that there's quite a bit of enthusiasm for Democrats on the ground. Now, I agree. They have not won Democrats have not won a statewide election in Texas since 1994, and they haven't won a Senate seat since 1988. And so I've been doing this for almost 20 years, and I've been hearing for that entire time that this is the year Texas is going to turn blue. It's sort of like Lucy in the football. Every time they hold it out there, and then they fall just short, just like Beto O'Rourke fell just short in 2018. But they've also flipped a state Senate seat recently in Fort Worth that was a heavy Trump seat. So there are some evidence of Democratic enthusiasm, and I think that Tallarico, sort of similar to for the Republican side, it's also more about style than ideology. They're both actually very liberal candidates, and it's not that Tallarico is necessarily more moderate than Crockett. He sounds more moderate. He's a Presbyterian going to seminary.
He's a minister.
He's talking about his faith. He's saying we need to reach out as a party to independents and Republicans versus Crockett's theory of the case, which hasn't really been tested though in Texas, and could, in this year of enthusiasm, could be a salient argument as well that they need to get out voters of color, that they need to get out base voters, and even concerns that maybe Tallarico could have a problem with black voters as well in a general election. So
there's been some heavy racial rhetoric in this primary. Just to be clear, though, we kind of brushed up upon this. Do you see, as some do, the conventional wisdom that Crockett would be more of a force in a primary, but Tallarico would be more of a force in the general? So in other words, Democrats might need to be careful what they ask for tonight.
In a state like Texas, you've got to win over Republicans and independents. That's just the way that the math is.
At least in a general election, to be a more likely success story.
And just the fact that Republicans are hoping and praying that it is Crockett. That we've seen Governor Abbott spend money trying to boost Crockett. We've seen Tallarico's super PAC emphasize that Republicans would rather run against her. So these are questions about electability, but it will tell us about something about the direction of both parties tonight.
Yeah. And finally, Jessica, on North Carolina, which also is holding a primary today. The primary itself isn't interesting. We know basically for certain it's Michael Whatley up against the former governor, Roy Cooper. What about those two up against each other in a general election? Is it too early to consider whether or not we're going to see the flipping of Senator Tillis' seat?
Well, early polling certainly shows that it's Roy Cooper, the former governor, who has a slight advantage there. Voters just don't know Whatley yet. He's the former state party chairman, former RNC chairman, but voters don't know him in the state versus they've elected Roy Cooper twice. And if this is turning out to be a strong Democratic year, I've heard from Republicans even that they're concerned about the way the independents are going in that state. And so we have this race rated as a toss-up. I think it is too early at this juncture, but I would rather be Roy Cooper than Michael Whatley right now.
All right, Jessica Taylor of the Cook Political Report joining us on this primary day. Thank you so much. We appreciate you being here in our Washington, D.C. studios. We continue to track what's happening here at home, but of course also what's happening in the Middle East, how that is influencing the markets. Equities are off the lows, but there is a lot of broad-based selling still today, including, interestingly, in some defense names. Lockheed, RTX, both actually lower on the day. I want to talk about another defense name, though, a defense tech company that Bloomberg's Ed Ludlow is making some news about today. Anduril, about to raise another $4 billion in funding. Ed Ludlow is joining us now from San Francisco for more. So, Ed, interesting that Jared Kushner's brother is helping lead this round.
Yeah, look, Thrive Capital, very active at the moment. They've just raised a new $10 billion fund. Anduril in particular, it's interesting that they're raising $4 billion at a post-money valuation of $60 billion, almost double their last round. But they're going with venture capital because the round's been co-led by Andreessen Horowitz. And, you know, this story is not new. The idea that the US military apparatus is much more closely aligned to Silicon Valley and being willing to do business with more nimble startups that are growing very quickly and are very focused on, you know, next generation systems, autonomous in the context of terrestrial, maritime, and air, wearables for fighting infantry, mixed reality, etc. So Anduril's growing very fast. It has a number of defense contracts with the US and its Western allies, gets a lot of grants from various US agencies and defense agencies. But right now they're using that capital to expand, particularly in the United States, their manufacturing footprint.
What do we make of the timing here, Ed? And it's great to spend some time with you here on this scoop. You know, we're obviously launching a new war against Iran here, which is throwing hundreds of thousands of drones at the U.S. and its allies. Not lost on us to see AeroVironment up 12% today, bouncing back from that tough sell-off yesterday. But it's getting all of the attention almost as a proxy for companies like these. Is an Anduril IPO inevitable? And what do you think of the timing?
Yeah, really appreciate the question. You know, we reported this round had kicked off last month. So, you know, the timing, it's just, you know, when they've made progress. No evidence, no reports that Anduril technology was used in Iran. They do have deployments in the Middle East at US bases for anti-drone systems. That's well documented. They have, you know, contracts with SOCOM. But again, like why I put emphasis on the venture capitalists backing them is that this is probably one of the last big pre-IPO rounds where Anduril wanted to attract some crossover investors. Again, proxy, yes. Last thing, Anduril gets a fraction of what the legacy primes get in contracts for missile defense, right? Yeah. So they have some way to go.
Ed, just quickly, before we run out of time here, there's been reporting from CBS today about the use of Anthropic's Claude in the operations against Iran, despite the Pentagon having ruled them a supply chain risk with the breakdown over the kind of security and ethics guidelines that Anthropic wanted the Pentagon to agree to. How should we consider this idea that the Pentagon still very much needs access to these systems, at least in the interim?
Yeah, what CBS reported, citing two anonymous sources, is not just that the Claude technology was used in the mission over the weekend, but it continues to be used. And that right now the status is that there is a blanket ban on Anthropic technology as directed by the President and Secretary of Defense. So, you know, it's fluid. You know, this all happened at the end of last week. And one would imagine, reading the Bloomberg coverage, that, you know, the planning and listening to the President earlier for this Iran operation was happening contemporaneously with Anthropic's relationship with the Pentagon playing out. But that's what CBS is saying, that it's still in use, and we wait to hear from the company.
Amazing. Ed, it's great to see you. Thanks for bringing that news to us here. Ed Ludlow with us live from San Francisco, the co-host of Bloomberg Tech. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kailey Leinz in Washington. We'll meet you back here for the late edition of Balance of Power, with much more to follow after the president's meeting today with the German Chancellor. Bloomberg Business Week Daily ahead on Bloomberg.